All. This is going to be a video recording that covers chapter 19. As you can see, it's called The Long 19th Century. Hopefully you're going to have an understanding of why it's called The Long 19th Century by the end of our discussion of the chapter. The other point that you're going to get to understand is why the long 19th century actually goes into 1914. So why does it go into the 20th century? I'm going to make a couple of recordings so that you don't have to listen to anything that's too long. So the first thing that I think we're going to cover in class, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, is an understanding of, just to take a pause, and understanding why Great Britain is called Great Britain at this point. There you see a timeline of English/British history, and at some point we can stop calling it England and start calling it Great Britain. So little trivia there, and then it goes. You get into the United Kingdom in the early 1800s. So if you said to yourself, we used to call this place England, now we call it Great Britain, there you see it's the joining of England and Wales, and then eventually the joining of England and Wales and Scotland, and then the United Kingdom adds in Ireland, and now Northern Ireland, and not Ireland as a whole. So you see a little bit of the progression of why we call Great Britain, and that is the very prominent country that takes center stage in this chapter, because this chapter about revolution in energy and industry certainly focuses on Great Britain, because that was the center of this growth in Europe. For the quote from your book, why Great Britain in terms of its industrialization, the abundant coal, the high wages, a relatively peaceful and centralized government, well-developed financial systems, innovative culture, highly skilled craftsmen, and a strong position in empire and global trade. So that's why we get, coming into the 1800s, that's why we get Great Britain rather, taking center stage. So when we talk about this innovation culture, you've taken a look at some of the innovation of the 1700s into the 1800s, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the mule, etc. How did all that begin? And you really get the phrase "necessity is the mother of invention." And I think you can think of on your own some examples of this phrase, how things crop up based on necessity. Well, in this case, necessity was how to make clothes in an efficient fashion because of the population that existed in Great Britain at the time. You had the technology to do it. You had people who were motivated, like John Kay, who invented the flying shuttle, which helped sewing. You had James Hargreaves, who invented the spinning jenny. You had Richard Arkwright, who kind of stole James Hargreaves' idea and created the water frame. And of course, James Watt with the rotary engine that would help to get things moving on those looms. At any rate, this happened because, one, the technology was there, two, these individuals had the money and the time, and three, they needed to think about more efficient ways to make clothes. You had your cottage industries and the cottage system that were working, but at this point, the population of Great Britain, and there you see it in that slide here. The largest towns, London had 860,000, Manchester 84,000, Edinburgh 82,000, etc. So you had high populations, and you also had the resources. You have these people taking advantage as these kind of quote unquote early factories develop after these technologies take hold of workers who are interested in, first of all, making a good living wage. Second of all, not having a better option. So you have things that crop up like these early textile factories. Wasn't always great for the people who were working. You had what was called apprenticeships, and those were really the taking advantage of young people to pay them very little or nothing to do the work that needed to be done. And eventually these apprenticeships were banned in the early 1800s, which was a good thing. There was clear attention to labor and to the treatment of laborers, albeit not the best attention. There was a pretty good attention. Another link to this concept of necessity as the mother of invention is the whole conversation around coal use in Great Britain. An abundance of coal helped drive the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. Well, before coal, if you remember from the chapter, there was wood and charcoal. Well, the problem is that if you look at this tiny island, you're going to run out of wood. And they would have run out of wood a lot faster than they would run out of coal because of the abundant coal supplies. So coal was basically begun to be mined because of the absence of timber, which was necessary to run steam engines, to run locomotives and things like that. So that helped. They couldn't ship in the timber from places like Russia that had an abundant amount. So coal became the go-to to fire up these steam engines, and that's another example of how necessity drove invention or necessity drove progress. So there you have, in this slide, you have the map of Europe and how you get the railroads, you have industrial areas, you have iron ore and coal fields. If you look at the key, so obviously Great Britain had a tremendous amount of railway development and also major industrial areas, but you see this also take hold, particularly in Central Europe, in Belgium, the German Confederation, all the way out to Poland. So that's really important when we look at how the Industrial Revolution spills over to the rest of Europe. You have things like the railroad, things like George Stephenson's rocket locomotive that began in Great Britain, but this concept of the railroad and the locomotive really did spread throughout the world, into America and other parts of the world. And that's just one example. So there was just lots of revolutions in textiles, revolution in the iron industry, to make those, and that's where you get the growth of coal, and just a tremendous amount of innovation. And then you have the after effects of that. As you can see, the railroads, of course, improved shipping and transportation. The painting that you saw in the first slide here from the first intercity railroad in the world from Manchester to Liverpool in 1830, just truly revolutionized travel and efficiency in that regard. And that just kind of with things that were cheaply made, or at least somewhat cheaply made, and accessible. You have this rapid industrialization, and again, it spread, across the pond to America post 1860, post Civil War. So you definitely have a tremendous amount of advancement there. And I would say if this time period centered on anything in Europe, it centered on innovation and advancement. It centered on social change, and it centered on a different understanding of labor by unions and protests against poor treatment of people, things of that nature. So moving on here, you've got just a lot of entrepreneurs, as I said, and that really kind of became like a showcase for people. And for an example of that showcase, people came together um, and gathered in 1851 at something called the Great Exhibition, and the Crystal Palace was the center of this great exhibition in Great Britain, and it was really kind of a celebration of Great Britain as the workshop of the world, and it was basically a full year. It was almost like an expo. We have these giant tech shows now, the CES show, and some other gatherings of major industry. There's South by Southwest, the Innovation Conference in Texas nowadays. Well, the Great Exhibition was just like that. It was a gathering of people and ideas, and it basically was a showcase of everything that Great Britain was doing. And it was housed in a building entirely made of glass, of crystal, at Kensington in London. So that's just one example of how people were really looking beyond themselves to show the rest of Europe, the rest of the world, what was going on. So you've got going all the way back to the spinning jenny, the water frame, Samuel Crompton, Hargraves, and etc. to Watt, to Stevenson with the rocket. The first locomotive actually was invented by a guy by the name of Richard Trevithick. He pioneered the first steam locomotive in South Wales. So again, you've got these just tremendous innovation around the island of Britain, and then it eventually did spread to the rest of the continent. Now there were exceptions to this spreading. So India, China, and Japan did not engage in this innovative culture yet. You have this great kind of quote-unquote fear of foreigners, or this xenophobia in Japan and China, and in India there just wasn't there wasn't necessarily infrastructure. And then in fact, you probably read in the chapter that India, you could purchase clothing, you could purchase textiles. It was cheaper to purchase textiles in India from Britain than it was to actually make it in India. So you have kind of the first example of Thomas Friedman's the world is flat concept, with this literal globalization in the 1800s, where Indians were mad. They were upset because this globalization was this global outreach was taking people's jobs in India, because it was, like I said, cheaper to buy clothes from Britain in India than it was to actually buy them made in India. So, but that did not necessarily spur the innovation culture, and at that point, India was becoming a pretty robust British colony. So they certainly did not advance that industrialization as much as they could have. There you see on this slide some of the Western European advantages. You had the groundwork for this industrialization in the putting out systems, understanding the rudimentary understanding of capitalism, and you had these the skilled artisans that already understood this. And then you had kind of the proximity of Europe to Great Britain, which meant they could just kind of steal their ideas. I mean, they didn't have as many copyright laws or things like that. I mean, they did have Britain did have laws where you couldn't leave the country if you had certain skills, or if you had certain corners of the market of industry. There were people that slipped out. Notably, a gentleman slipped out into Belgium, into Brussels, and created. He and his brother created a tremendous industrial center there, using a lot of the technology that that was started in Great Britain. So you have kind of the proximity of the continent of Europe that helped to spur on this advancement. And lastly, you had a lot of strong governments by the 1800s. Regardless of the revolutions that we're going to discuss in the mid 1800s, you have a strong British government. You have a strong French government. You have and speaking of Belgium, they split off from the Netherlands, definitively in the 1800s. So you had that, and you had a very strong German Confederation. As you can see, Prussia was gaining strength, and then you have Bohemia in the south and Poland in the east. So just very strong governments. So those three advantages took Western Europe by storm. You didn't have that in Russia. You had a much more agrarian economy. You didn't have that in Spain. You had a much more agrarian economy in the Ottoman Empire, and you didn't have as tight knit, industrial centers. So, and then there you see the map of Italy. You see we're not going to get to the unification of Italy until much later in the 1800s. So that's going to help to prevent them from industrializing more quickly. So there you see some of the examples of how Western Europe became the industrial center of the world. Just a few more bits of review. I mentioned William Cockerell. He was the gentleman who slipped out with his brother into Belgium to to build that industrial strength. And you had other examples of that. Fritz Harcourt in Germany, doing very similar things. There was resistance to this, to Great Britain and to the kind of buying of goods and services, and we're going to get to capitalism really more in the next chapter when we talk a lot about the isms. But an example of this was France setting really high tariffs after 1815, after the Napoleonic wars, and that tried to spur their industry, but it didn't really work. And I don't know if that sounds familiar or not, but it should, because of what's going on in the United States right now. You've got this discussion around tariffs against, and high taxes on things coming in from China and other parts of the world. That could potentially hurt American business. Well, that remains to be seen, but it's kind of an example of how a country wanted to spur innovation on their own by getting a little bit more isolationist, and that it didn't really help France in this scenario. You see other improvements. I mentioned the railroads, but the building of canals, which becomes extremely important in the United States. In the 1820s and the 1830s, you have more roads that are being built, and of course more railways. So really, you get a growth of industry, you get growth of infrastructure, you get growth of individuals, wealth and individual but then you've got the state economies that blow up, and it really does just really transform Europe coming into the 1800s. And the last thing that really helped was this changing concept of banking, and this started in Belgium. And I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's called limited liability. And basically what it means is, if it's essentially a guarantee of certain amount of money. If you borrowed money from a bank, you were only in that, for instance, that bank went under, or there wasn't enough capital to make sure that things were held up. You wouldn't lose all of what you had and what you borrowed or whatever. And so it allowed for people to more safely borrow money. So the number one thing that you need to know about limited liability, it allowed individuals and entrepreneurs and early corporations to borrow more money more safely, so that they wouldn't risk more of a loss than they could. And that really helped to spur loans. It's kind of like thinking about like lowering interest rates nowadays. If you lower interest rates, you get money more cheaply. If you borrow money at 2%, then obviously you're going to want to borrow. You can borrow more of it. Whereas if you're borrowing money at 10%, you could borrow less because the interest is higher. It's kind of like that. But it just allows for people to borrow more money, to put more money into these businesses. and get them off the ground. So that is a very, very quick snapshot of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain and in the rest of Europe. We are going to turn to working conditions. We're going to turn to kind of concerns around the Industrial Revolution. We're going to turn to how governments attended to the Industrial Revolution in our next video.